The first report came from a bank fraud investigator in Phoenix. A loan application contained inconsistencies. The credit history was real, but belonged to someone else. The employment records checked out, but the employer had never heard of the applicant. The address existed, but the person claiming to live there was someone entirely different. Standard fraud, except the sophistication suggested professional identity theft on a scale the investigator had never encountered. Federal investigators traced the fraudulent application to a residential neighborhood in a mid-sized city 3 states away. The address led to an apartment complex. The name on the lease matched the loan application. But when agents knocked on the door, a different person answered. Same physical appearance, same voice on recorded phone calls, but a completely different identity with different documentation, different employment, and different financial records. That discovery triggered a deeper investigation that revealed something extraordinary. The person living in that apartment was operating under at least 12 separate identities, different names, different social security numbers, different driver's licenses, different credit histories. Each identity had been carefully constructed over years, establishing legitimate paper trails, building credit scores, creating employment histories, and maintaining separate lives that appeared completely normal to anyone checking records. U.S. Marshals were brought in when the scope became clear. This wasn't simple fraud. This was systematic identity manipulation by someone who'd perfected the ability to exist as multiple people simultaneously. And he was living in a residential neighborhood, surrounded by families who had no idea their neighbor had a dozen different legal identities. The fugitive's real name was unknown. His original identity had been abandoned so long ago that tracing it back proved nearly impossible. What investigators knew was that he'd been operating under false identities for at least 15 years. He'd committed financial fraud, evaded law enforcement in 3 states, and disappeared multiple times when authorities got close. Now he'd been located, but determining which identity he was currently using and how to approach someone with that level of deception capability created unique challenges. Surveillance began immediately. The apartment was in a complex housing 84 units. Young families, elderly residents, single professionals, a typical cross-section of working-class America living in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and low crime rates. The fugitive blended perfectly into this environment, presenting as a normal resident while maintaining a criminal operation that exploited the trust and openness that made communities function. Initial observation identified him leaving the apartment at 7:30 a.m. weekday mornings, dressed in business casual attire, carrying a briefcase. He drove a modest sedan registered under one of his aliases. He returned at 6 p.m. most evenings. He occasionally walked to a nearby coffee shop on weekends. He waved to neighbors. He collected mail. He appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a mid-level professional living a quiet suburban life. But deeper investigation revealed the complexity. The vehicle was registered under the name Michael Patterson. The apartment lease was under David Chen. His employment records showed him working as Robert Martinez at a consulting firm that existed only on paper. His bank accounts were split between 5 different names at 3 different institutions. His credit cards, loans, utilities, and subscriptions were all distributed across different identities to avoid any single profile appearing suspicious. Financial forensics traced his He'd obtain legitimate documents for each identity through sophisticated means, birth certificates from deceased individuals whose deaths hadn't been properly recorded in all databases, social security numbers from people who'd left the country permanently, driver's licenses obtained through corrupted DMV employees. Each component was carefully selected and assembled to create identities that would withstand routine verification. With each identity established, he'd build financial history, open bank accounts with small deposits, apply for modest credit cards and make regular payments, establish utility service and pay on time, create employment records with companies that existed only as LLC paperwork. Within 2 years, each identity would have excellent credit, verifiable history, and the appearance of a stable, responsible citizen. Then, he'd leverage those identities, apply for loans using falsified income documentation, open credit lines and max them out, make large purchases on credit with no intention of payment, then disappear that identity while maintaining his others. The financial institutions would pursue collection against someone who didn't exist. The real identity owner, if they'd ever existed, had been dead for years or lived overseas, unaware their information had been stolen. Over 15 years, investigators estimated he defrauded banks, creditors, and financial institutions of at least $4 million. But the true figure was likely higher because many of his identities remained undiscovered. Each identity operated independently. A fraud committed as Robert Martinez didn't connect to David Chen. When one identity became compromised, he simply stopped using it and activated another. The residential neighborhood created complications. Standard arrest procedures assumed approaching the fugitive at home or intercepting him during routine activities. But someone operating under multiple identities might have escape plans, hidden resources, or associates ready to provide assistance. He'd evaded capture before by disappearing when pressure increased. This time, investigators needed to ensure all his identities were compromised simultaneously, so he couldn't simply become someone else. Marshals coordinated with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, Social Security Administration, and multiple state agencies. The goal was identifying every active identity, locating all financial accounts and assets, and executing coordinated arrest and asset seizure that would prevent him from accessing any resources or assuming any additional identities. The investigation expanded. Surveillance tracked his daily routines under his primary residential identity. Financial monitoring flagged activity across all known accounts. Digital forensics analyzed his internet activity to identify additional identities or fraud schemes in progress. Every element of his operation was documented and mapped. Pattern analysis revealed his methodology. He maintained 3 to 4 active identities at any given time for daily operations. Another 4 to 6 identities remained dormant with established credit and history, but no recent activity. The remaining identities were either burned from previous fraud operations or in early establishment phases building credibility for future use. His apartment became a focal point. Search warrant authorization required demonstrating probable cause that evidence of crimes existed inside. Financial fraud provided that basis, but executing the warrant required careful timing. The fugitive's sophistication suggested he might have alerts, dead drops, or fail-safe systems that would trigger if he suspected law enforcement interest. Neighbors were interviewed discreetly. Most knew him as David Chen, a quiet consultant who traveled frequently for work. Some had seen him receiving packages regularly, which he explained as work materials, Others noted he rarely had visitors and didn't participate in community events. A few mentioned he'd lived in the complex for 2 years, but they knew almost nothing personal about him beyond casual greetings. That isolation was tactical. Close relationships meant questions about background, family, personal history. Maintaining distance prevented scrutiny. He was friendly enough to avoid suspicion, but distant enough to preserve operational security. In a neighborhood where people generally minded their own business, this approach kept him invisible. Property records revealed he'd rented apartments under different names in 6 cities over the past 10 years. Each rental lasted 18 to 36 months before he relocated. That time frame aligned with the life cycle of his fraud operations. Establish presence, build identity credibility, execute fraud schemes, exit before consequences materialized, then relocate and repeat with fresh identities in a new location. His current residence was approaching the 2-year mark. Analysis suggested he might be planning another relocation soon. That urgency accelerated the operation timeline. If he moved before arrest, tracking him would require starting the investigation from scratch in an unknown location. The window for action was closing. Thursday morning, marshals positioned teams around the apartment complex. The fugitive left for work at his usual time. Surveillance followed him to a coffee shop where he worked on a laptop for several hours. During that time, search teams executed the warrant on his apartment. The apartment appeared ordinary. Furniture from standard retailers, kitchen stocked with normal groceries, bedroom with neatly made bed. But in a locked closet, investigators found the infrastructure of his operation. Filing cabinets containing documents for 12 separate identities, boxes of blank checks for various accounts, laminating equipment for creating fake identification, computer equipment with encrypted drives, and cash totaling $63,000 in a fireproof safe. The documents were methodically organized. Each identity had a dedicated folder containing birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, bank statements, credit card information, employment records, and detailed notes about the identity's history and active status. He maintained spreadsheets tracking which identities were in use, which were dormant, and which were being established. The operation was systematic, professional, and had clearly been refined over many years. Digital forensics began immediately on his computers. Encrypted drives were copied for analysis. Bank account passwords were documented. Email accounts were preserved. Every piece of evidence that could prevent him from accessing resources or rebuilding his operation was secured. While the search continued, the fugitive remained under surveillance at the coffee shop. He worked on his laptop, made phone calls, and appeared completely unaware that his apartment was being systematically dismantled. His confidence was remarkable. Years of successful operation had created a sense of invulnerability that was about to be shattered. At 3:47 p.m., he packed his laptop and left the coffee shop. Surveillance teams tracked him driving toward his apartment complex. Marshals positioned for arrest were notified. The fugitive pulled into his assigned parking space, collected his briefcase, and walked toward his building. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, reached his apartment door, inserted his key. The door opened before he could turn the lock. Marshals had been inside waiting. He was confronted by 6 federal agents in tactical gear. His face showed shock, then calculation, then resignation. He raised his hands without resistance. The entire arrest took 15 seconds. No violence, no drama. Just the end of a 15-year criminal career built on deception and false identities. The interrogation revealed the full scope. He'd started with a single stolen identity in his early 20s after accumulating gambling debts. That first fraud succeeded, and he realized the vulnerabilities in the system. Over time, he'd refined his methods, expanded his operations, and built a lifestyle funded entirely by fraudulent identities. He had no permanent residence under his real name, no legitimate employment, no authentic relationships. His entire existence was constructed from stolen and fabricated identities. He moved between personas like actors changing costumes, each identity serving a specific purpose in his fraud schemes. When asked why he'd maintained so many identities simultaneously, he explained the redundancy. If one identity became compromised, he had others to fall back on. If law enforcement pursued one name, he could simply become someone else. The system worked because each identity operated independently, with no obvious connections to the others. But that independence created his downfall. The bank investigator who flagged his Phoenix loan application triggered a cascade. Federal authorities connected that fraud to similar cases in other states. Pattern analysis identified common methodologies. Financial forensics traced money flows. Digital investigation revealed communications. And eventually, all the separate identities converged on one physical person living in one apartment in one residential neighborhood. Neighbors watched from windows and doorways as he was led to a Marshal's vehicle in handcuffs. Most were shocked. David Chen had seemed so normal, so quiet, so ordinary. Learning he was actually a wanted fugitive operating under a dozen fake names living among their families created profound unease. If he could hide in plain sight, who else might be concealing dangerous secrets? The apartment complex management struggled with the revelation. They'd conducted background checks before approving his lease. Everything had cleared. David Chen had excellent credit, solid employment verification, and clean rental history. But David Chen didn't exist. He was a fabrication created specifically to pass those checks. The system designed to protect residents had been exploited by someone who understood its vulnerabilities. Financial institutions began recovering assets. The $63,000 in cash was seized. Bank accounts under all 12 identities were frozen. Credit lines were closed. Loans entered default proceedings. But much of the $4 million he'd stolen over 15 years had been spent, hidden, or converted into untraceable forms. Recovery would be partial at best. Victims of his fraud schemes were notified. Some were institutions that could absorb the losses. Others were individuals whose identities had been stolen and used to create his fake personas. Those victims faced years of legal and financial complications as they worked to prove they hadn't committed the frauds associated with their stolen information. The investigation expanded internationally. Some of the identities he'd created used information from individuals in other countries. Coordination with foreign law enforcement revealed similar fraud operations in Canada, Mexico, and several European nations. The fugitive had operated globally, creating identities and committing fraud across borders with sophistication that impressed even experienced investigators. Prosecutors assembled charges spanning multiple jurisdictions and 15 years of criminal activity: identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, social security fraud, false statements to federal agencies. Each identity represented multiple charges. The total potential sentence exceeded 200 years. Plea negotiations would reduce that substantially. but he would spend decades in federal prison. His case became training material for law enforcement agencies. The sophistication of his operation demonstrated evolving criminal tactics that traditional fraud detection systems weren't designed to catch. His ability to create and maintain multiple identities with independent financial histories exploited fundamental assumptions about identity verification in the digital age. Security experts analyzed his methodology, the use of deceased individuals' information, the exploitation of database gaps between state and federal systems, the creation of legitimate appearing employment histories through paper companies. Each technique was documented and shared across law enforcement networks to improve detection capabilities. Financial institutions updated their verification procedures. The case demonstrated that excellent credit history and verified employment didn't guarantee authenticity. New protocols required deeper verification, cross-referencing multiple databases and analyzing patterns that might indicate synthetic or stolen identities. Residential property managers received guidance about tenant screening. Background checks needed to verify not just credit and criminal history, but also confirm the applicant's identity actually belonged to the person applying. The fugitive's ability to pass standard screenings while living under fake names highlighted systematic vulnerabilities in housing rental processes. For the neighborhood where he'd lived for 2 years, the aftermath created lasting awareness. Residents became more conscious of who lived among them. Community groups organized to improve neighbor connections. The isolation that had allowed the fugitive to operate unnoticed became something people actively worked against. Knowing your neighbors became not just friendly, but protective. The fugitive's real identity was eventually discovered through old military records. He'd served briefly in the Army 23 years earlier, before being discharged for conduct violations. That authentic identity had been abandoned decades ago, replaced by the rotating cast of fake personas that became his true existence. Investigators were astonished to find that even his closest criminal associates only knew him by whichever identity he was using during their interactions. Psychologists studied his case with interest. Living as multiple people simultaneously required extraordinary compartmentalization and memory. Each identity needed consistent behavior, history, and characteristics. Maintaining 12 separate personas without confusion or mistakes demonstrated cognitive capabilities that, applied legitimately, could have achieved significant success. When asked why he chose fraud over legitimate work, he simply stated that legitimate work couldn't provide the income or lifestyle he wanted. The fraud was lucrative, and for 15 years, it had worked. He expressed no remorse for victims or institutions he'd defrauded. He viewed the financial system as a game with rules he'd learned to exploit. Getting caught was simply a risk he'd always known existed. His apartment was cleared and released back to the complex. New tenants moved in within weeks. The neighborhood continued its normal routines. Children played in common areas. Residents walked dogs. Life returned to the comfortable normalcy that had existed before they learned a master identity thief had been living among them. But for law enforcement personnel who worked the case, the operation demonstrated both the vulnerabilities and resilience of modern identity systems. One person had exploited weaknesses to create 12 separate lives. Hundreds of investigators had coordinated across agencies and jurisdictions to dismantle that operation. The balance between privacy protection and fraud prevention remained challenging, But this case provided valuable lessons about where improvements were needed. The fugitive was convicted on 47 federal charges. He received a sentence of 28 years in federal prison. Appeals would follow. Restitution orders would be issued. But his career as a multi-identity fraudster had ended. The man who'd existed as 12 different people simultaneously would spend decades being known by just one number in the federal prison system. For the residents of the apartment complex, the case became a story they told cautiously. The quiet neighbor who turned out to be a wanted fugitive, living under fake names. The criminal who operated among families for 2 years without anyone suspecting. The arrest that reminded everyone that safety required vigilance, even in peaceful neighborhoods. And for marshals who tracked and arrested him, the operation represented successful coordination, patient investigation, and ultimate justice. One fugitive removed from circulation, one complex fraud operation dismantled, and one neighborhood made safer by law enforcement personnel who worked invisibly to protect communities from threats most residents never knew existed.